Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Addressing Disparities in Access to Cell and Gene Therapies, hosted in partnership with CGT Global, previously known as STEM Express. I'm Georgie Makin, VP of Digital and Editorial at Facilitate, and today I am joined by a great panel of guest speakers who will shortly be introduced to you. Before we get started, however, I wanted to take a second to run through a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I would just like to remind you that we encourage our audience to submit questions to our speakers, so please do submit your questions via the Q&A widget accessible via the bottom of your screen. We may also attempt to answer your questions offline should we run out of time. This session is being recorded and will be available on demand shortly after the conclusion of the event. You'll be able to watch the session via the Facilitate website, or if you're joining us from the network, via the event page there. I'll now hand over to Kate to start today's session. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Georgie, and hello to everyone who's joining us today. We're just going to run through just a quick presentation here. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. So just to kind of explain, CGT Global, as Georgie mentioned, we used to be STEM Express. But our focus today, and really the focus of the company, is how we're advancing cutting-edge cell and gene therapies and the ways in which we're doing that, and the topics we're going to be touching base on today. So a quick, for those who may be new to the cell and gene therapy space, there are lots of different therapies coming to market, a very common one called CAR T therapies. Just want to touch on this briefly for those folks who might be new to the space. But actively, the focus in cell and gene therapy is really using cells, either a patient's own cells or cells from another individual, to basically treat different forms of diseases that are going on. And so there's different processes for which to do that, but I would say the easiest one in kind of explaining this and using CAR T is basically modifying T cells and putting them back into the body to help deal with different types of cancer specifically that are going on today. A number of the therapies that are currently approved on market are listed here. There's a handful today that are actively approved. You can see briefly here the different areas that they touch. There's obviously been a heavy focus in the initial therapies at blood cancers that are affecting people, but there's a lot happening also for tumor-related therapies that are coming to market. Some of these timelines and therapies vary pretty wildly from the time that it takes to either receive the cells in the patient or then do some process of manufacturing. And so you can see kind of on this time frame of 3 to 4 weeks up through 15 days and 4 weeks that basically from the time of collection to reinfusion. That brings a unique set of challenges we're going to be talking about today in, for example, where do patients stay when they're coming first to have cells collected from them to actually be reinfused. If they're having to travel great distances, those really can create challenges for individual patients and for the healthcare systems themselves and how they're dealing with that. So we're going to get into that as a topic as well. A number of the therapies that have come to market are coming to get today faster and faster. When you look back in time of the approved therapies that I referenced in the previous slide, you can see this timeline of really the progression of those therapies and the times that they've hit. But today that is starting to speed up faster and faster. The gaps are getting shorter and shorter. And I think that brings a very interesting challenge to our healthcare partners in trying to figure out how to make these therapies available to patients that need them. And so we're going to be discussing some of those challenges as well. Another slide that tends to overwhelm quite a number of people, and for some of the hospital executives I work with, they'll jokingly say this is the slide that makes them lose sleep. But in the center circle of this is the current therapies that we just discussed that are approved on market today. In the progressive rings that come out from this are different phase trials that are active in the different spaces. You can see on the outside circle the different areas that they are focused in, and these sort of grouping of these different companies and their active FDA approvals that they're seeking. But today, as of my last count, which was about 5 days ago, I think there's 3,200 currently pending approval. So when I think about the market today and I think about the handful of therapies that are approved and the impact that's already having to healthcare and to patients everywhere, I think the real question for us that we're going to be getting into today is how do we adapt, scale, and pivot around what's coming in the market and what do we need to be thinking about as a community to really be able to support this space. An area of focus for us at CGT is really apheresis, and that's including from a bedside standpoint inside the hospital as well as our own clinics. So, we have focused at saying, most of these cellular products that are on market have to start from collecting the cells. And so a big area that we have is individual locations where we have individual suites for patients. So if they're immunocompromised, they don't have the risk of being in a large, maybe blood bank setting or things of that nature. And then also, how do we deal with those challenges of the patients that are too sick to travel? And so we provide bedside support to healthcare partners as well. We staff at some facilities 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, where we can manage those bedside collections too. And then the GMP manufacturing is a very broad topic, but I think that for different parts of the process, you may need different abilities to open or access the bags or freeze down parts of the samples in different ways, depending on the partner manufacturer you might be working with or the pharmaceutical company. They need things in different ways. This again is not a typical feature of most hospitals to have GMP manufacturing inside the healthcare facility. So how do you partner that with a company that you're working with before shipping that out to the pharmaceutical company? We use a technology through Biospherics and an ISO 5 bioisolators. We like that product. It's very flexible for us, but it allows that sort of step down process from our clinics, and then being able to see, as you can see in the picture here, any sort of bag manipulation or freezing down of the cells that we might need to do. So I'll pause there, Georgie. I'll kind of stop there as we kind of move into to our discussions.
Yeah, thank you for setting the scene there, Kate. We are about to launch into our discussion with our panel. So we'll get kicked off first of all with a few questions focused on the regulatory landscape, following on from the information presented in Kate's slides there. So Kate, with the FDA approvals landscape as it is, what are some of the challenges related to disparities with patient access to cell and gene therapies?
Yeah, so in most of the hospitals that we've partnered with, some that go back a decade-long relationship, we've seen hospitals, really struggle to be able to even bring on one of the current therapies that are approved to market. It's an incredibly significant endeavor for hospitals to take that on. And I think then in looking at how do they optimize that, right from the coverages of costs that are there today to what insurance is covering, there's a pretty wide spectrum of difference. And then how does the hospital really optimize that procedure and collection and retransfusion in a way that allows them to want to do it over and over again for patients, right? I hate to say it, sort of broadly speaking, but of the conversations that I'm in, but I think that if it's wildly expensive and only half of it is covered by insurance, right, you can understand the pain points that a healthcare institution might go through in saying, do we want to do patient 2, patient 3, et cetera. Something that Dr. Brannigan and I talk a lot about is these treatments have been sort of a last line of care for a lot of patients. And how do we look at wanting to move those therapies forward? I think everyone in our market and in our space and the pharma companies that are working on this want to see these brought forward as a first line of care. A really important step in doing that is getting the costs down for healthcare providers. And helping them optimize that in a way that is scalable. Otherwise, they can't lean into that as much as they might want to, right? That becomes a really big challenge. The second part of that is the bottlenecking that happens around major institutions. And Georgie, like you asked, is, thinking about patient access, thinking about patient availability to these cells and how do they get access? Well, if you're living in, Manhattan or Texas or, Boston and places like this, you have big institutions that are readily available to lean in and provide this access. But if you're traveling from long distances, I know Sarah and I yesterday were talking about a patient coming in from Maine, right? If you're coming from these great distances, there's not only the issue of the travel and access and who has the ability to really be able to do that, versus saying if you lived regionally within the area of a location. So a big focus of not only CGT, but our sort of reach right now is trying to figure out how to make something scalable for hospitals in Arkansas and hospitals, overseas and in locations where maybe the healthcare system can't quite support that growth. And so I think these partnerships, these scalable solutions are something that we all need to keep talking about and working towards.
Excellent, thank you. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add surrounding the challenges, perhaps with focusing specifically on the disparities for patient access?
Well, I'll say a few words. I'm Andrew Brannigan. I'm a medical director at CGT Global and an attending physician at Mass General Hospital in Boston, where I'm on the steering committee for cell therapies. And we have a very growing program of cell therapy. And what I really want to bring it back to is how important these therapies are to the patients. We had such a nice overview by Kate on how these therapies work, and they really are game changing. So, like most therapies with cancer, these are tried on the sickest patients who don't have many options left. And so now we have therapies where people would have died from their lymphomas and they can be cured from their lymphomas. Patients with multiple myeloma that would be dead within a couple months and they had years to live, really high quality life. And because these were used in the sickest patients with very weakened immune systems, had lots of prior therapies, we also expect as we use these sooner, these therapies will probably work a lot better, and those trials are ongoing and very promising. So because they're so complicated, so expensive, there's so many issues with access that we've been struggling with from the beginning. And I think we touched on a lot of them today, and I'm looking forward to going into some of those things in more detail. One thing we didn't yet touch on is the patient themselves who is battling cancer has to get linked up with this timeline of manufacturing. And that's sometimes very hard to do because you might be rapidly progressing and you can't wait 4 weeks to be for your product to be manufactured. So unfortunately, we lose some patients that just can't wait. And then we have this incredible responsibility to prioritize who gets the spots for therapy. At our institution, we try to do this in an equitable way. Who has the most needs? A lot of this comes down to the luck of when you're actually ready with your disease course, because you really have to. There's a small window when you're actually ready for this. But there's really a lot of factors, and I won't ramble on and on. but I think you have some great topics that I'm happy to go to next, unless anyone else has some more comments.
Excellent. We'll move on to the agenda discussion just to make sure that we get everything covered. But if we focus on the regulatory aspect there, how you referenced timelines there, Dr. Brannigan, were kind of more related to manufacturing, but how can regulatory timelines impact, affect, or I suppose impede patient access to cell therapies? Kate, did you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think, and it'd be great to hear, from Sarah and Dr. Brannigan here too with this. But I think that I see it broadly, sort of, working within the administration side of more of with the healthcare executives in our space. And I think that when we all know that things move slowly within a healthcare environment, especially those that are maybe new to this space that are trying to figure out how to move quickly. And so I think, how to remove some of those bottlenecks, not only administratively, but between the physicians and the nurses and making sure folks are online. And I know, for example, like Sarah's position is a new position that she helped develop at Mass Gen. So maybe, Sarah, you can talk to that a little bit too, of just like how you see those timelines affect patients and what you're doing and your institution is doing to help speed that up.
Sure. I think one of the important things is you have to be nimble and quick. We have patients that when they get referred into us, as Dr. Brannigan said, this is not their first line of chemo, of the treatment they progress through. So the nurse navigator and our institution has sort of created a service so that we have a small central team that's sort of managing these patients. And we're building it out actually this summer. We have a patient navigator role that helps to get the records right away. Because the problem is we're looking at weeks, and sometimes weeks makes a difference. So one of my pain points is the prior auth from the insurance companies, because what happens is patient gets, like I have a patient, I'll give you a good example of real life example right now. I have a patient who's admitted to the hospital right now, progressive disease, so it needs to be admitted. We have a collection spot that is lined up on Monday, also lined up with a manufacturer on Monday. So our manufacturing slots for are sometimes can be limited. So we have a slot that we can have on Monday. However, her insurance approval, and we had originally held a slot for her at the end of the month. A slot came open, she got admitted. We'd like to collect her on Monday. However, the insurance approval will take 2 weeks. So do we collect at risk and, you know, waiting for the insurance approval, or do we try to find some sort of therapy in the meantime to bridge her until August 31st? So that's an example of questions that the physician and the providers are wrestling with. Ideally, I could collect her on Monday, and then she could start more treatment, bridging therapy until the time their cells are delivered.
And Sarah, maybe I could ask a follow-up question in that, because I was just on a call day before yesterday with someone who works with the kind of head of Blue Shield, and we were just discussing setting up a call. I think that the insurance providers are coming up to speed in a different way in their own involvement here. And what I'm hearing from you say is that they may need to think about the way that they're sort of similar to like what you've created at Mass Gen, right? But create sort of a tactical approach to some of these therapies and approvals that speed that up versus sort of their normal process that may be used to saying, oh, you know, you have a planned surgery a month from now. We have all the time in the world to approve this versus something so significant like this that's life-threatening, and maybe some sort of an accelerated platform to that. Am I hearing you right with that, Sarah, that seems like that could be a helpful approach?
It could be. I think that some of them will do an expedited 3 to 4 day turnaround time. However, they're getting more requests for those. So you know, when there were less CAR T patients getting treatment, you know, it was easier to do, but you know, some of the feedback I've gotten is that they're getting more of these requests, so they can't turn around quite as quickly. And some insurance is better than others. Some will be a quick turnaround, a couple of days, but then others it's like 2 weeks, like this patient on Monday.
I think actually while we're on the subject, we'll move through to another agenda point, actually focusing on the processes around the insurance landscape, because I think it is something that we've opened something up there for discussion that would be interesting in continuing further while we're on the topic. But how can the process or insurance landscape be described within this space if we're thinking about patients and their access to cell and gene therapies? What is that process currently, and how would you describe it, I suppose?
So
Sarah,
when patient comes, so I live this. This is my life. So when a patient comes in for a consult, there are several tests that we need to gather for the patient for the insurance process. They're looking for an echocardiogram. Sometimes they're looking for recent imaging and infectious disease lab work. Some of these are easy to collect on the same day. Others, like the echo, is always a sticking point because the insurance company want the echo as part of their approval process. The echoes they are not same day. Sometimes they have nothing that month. So we have to say, we've got it scheduled, please do the approval. Anyway, we promise we're gonna get the echo. It's scheduled for, you know, September 6th. That's the kind of timeline we're looking at. So if you know, these are the things that they want before our finance can submit for approval.
And what's the patient experience there? Like, how are people generally feeling, or how are they managed? Does anybody want to speak to what that patient experience is when they're actually considering that insurance coverage process within the context of these therapies?
So it varies based on the insurance. So some of some insurances go easily, but I recently had one that the patient said their insurance had been very good about covering everything, but they ran into, and this was a patient that we, because of their rapid disease, we collected at risk and we're trying to get the approval, thought it was all done. Cells are ready to come back, just about. Patient is in the hospital, she's sick, and and the insurance still isn't approved. And then we find out that the insurance the appeal had to fall on the patient's husband, who we, doing a little more digging, had just given up. He had thrown in the towel. And because it was going through the patient's family, patient and the family, we weren't following along and I had an idea that he needed extra help. So we are trying to address that with a close link between, with our new position, just following on that finance part in the insurance. And he's finding information just by calling. He's doing a lot of phone calls.
You know, Sarah, this may be a little side topic, and maybe Andrew too, you can think about this, but I'm just so curious, you know, when I used to work in the hospital at Santa Barbara Cottage and worked in the emergency room, right, if a patient came in with a broken leg, like they, you know, sort of, there was no question that we were moving that person into surgery to like, you know, do surgery on their leg, and the instant sort of triage nurse, you know, authorizations were done. It sort of happened in a magical setting, you know, that I think we're just so used to saving someone's life in these fashions, right? It just sort of progresses. But what's interesting, Sarah, about what you're bringing up, it's making me think of this, is that even though these are so instant and life-savingly necessary, there seems to be this sort of different approach to delay and appeal and everything else that's going on behind the scenes that I think more broadly we, you know, as a society need to dig into, and as a group need to bring those partners maybe more into the fold of these discussions. Would you agree with that, Sarah and Dr. Brannigan?
For sure. I think that's a great point. I think this is a new frontier, and we need different policies, and it's going to take some time to catch up. So I think partnerships to advocate for that, including partnerships like George has, I think, and he might have some comments on this, would be extremely valuable.
You're just muted there, George.
Sorry about that. I think coupling the manufacturing slot issue that Sarah called to and combining that with the payer prior approval, it leads to such a rocky path for patients and what we're hearing here at the Emily Whitehead Foundation, that it's really hard to think about those things while you're going through the diagnosis. And as we've seen commercially approved therapies, I don't think we have enough on the market to standardize messaging as to blanketly what this looks like with both of those combined. So we're exploring ways at the foundation here. How do we communicate that on a global level, not on a approved therapy to approved therapy basis? Because the main tenets of these processes look the same. There's a collection, there's a manufacturer, there's an administration, there's a lot of insurance headache. How do we provide that messaging for delivery of cell therapies as a whole is something we're exploring, and it's still evolving.
What actions do we think would support the industry? So what changes would happen from an insurance or a financial coverage point of view that actually would improve patient access here? Is there anything that perhaps we can model from other industries or other examples of healthcare that we'd like to see applied to this space?
Yeah, I think that's from our perspective, a very loaded question. The single payer systems in the NHS in the UK, there's certain abilities and connection in the smaller state. Here in the US, obviously, we operate drastically different, which can lead to even more disparity based upon who your insurer is, where you're located geographically, your desire to pursue more cutting edge treatments. There's a lot more options. So I think there's a lot more to be asked there on the policy side to figure this out. And it's still very early. I think we're 6 years into the first ever approval, but no answers yet, but lots of questions.
What do we think, Sarah? I think I'll come to you for this question to kick this one off. But what do we think, from a financial coverage view and in general, could be done to improve access to cell and gene therapies? But thinking more about encouraging improved frontline adoption, like what here can actually encourage more clinical delivery, I'd say, in this arena.
Do you mean like with the insurance coverage, like
I think
getting the
just
prior
generally
auths?
yeah, and I think looking at the financial coverage in general, if we open up that topic, what do you think would actually encourage that frontline adoption?
I find with different insurance companies, some of them have different understandings of CAR T therapy. So occasionally run into a case manager who's looking for a lot of extra information, and we have to like go back and say, no, this is not a transplant. We don't do these tests. So I think that is, and I'm not sure how you'd go about the education part, but I think that is certainly a problem that we run into occasionally. Others are great, and once they have it, they're good. We had to work with the state of New Hampshire because we had a patient coming, or actually Maine, coming down, who was like a Maine care patient, and they hadn't had a lot of CAR T patients. So we had to do a lot of educating, and I think that it'll be better for the next ones that have to come because they just didn't know.
Yeah, and Sarah, thank you for that. I was just going to mention too, I think something to add into that is, and Georgie, to that question, is that you know, we see a pretty large even disparity amongst healthcare partners in being able to do what Sarah just described so eloquently, right? So with a lot of these institutions, especially if they're new to it as well, you know, do they have people on staff that can help educate the insurer or the state or country? I know Andrew and I've talked about, you know, people coming in from other countries to Mass Gen as well, right? So having to educate those individuals. And sometimes, unfortunately, I find physicians are on these calls trying to educate the end party about you know what's needed here, and to Sarah's point, like what should be required or not required based on their understanding. And you know, again, that just takes a lot of time away from direct patient care, right? When we're having to have folks in the industry try to educate groups to bring them along. So I think that goes back to these questions, right? You know, what do we need to think about in bringing those people into the fold? I know, Georgie, you and I've talked about this with Facilitate, like how do we get these participants to participate, you know, at a different level in these conversations, so we can start that education process before it's patient, you know, so-and-so, and the person's on the phone trying to get approval. How can we help that be done in advance?
Excellent, thank you. I think we'll move on to, or back to rather, the agenda, just to make sure that we're covering everything that we've previously discussed. So moving on to that next topic for discussion, we'll take a look at physical location and geographical restrictions impacting access. Now, some of these physical location related restrictions may appear obvious, and actually we have already referred to, but for the purpose of some of these questions, we'll just focus on where changes or where challenges either encourage, impact, or impede the greatest impact, the greatest effects essentially on patient access. So first of all, one aspect we've highlighted in previous conversations ahead of this session is that some of these challenges are focused on cell and gene therapy clinical delivery being centered around academic centers and thereby limiting access. George, would you like to speak to some of these challenges in this area?
Yeah, I think from the logistical side, you can look at the front end and the back end. I was at a large academic center a couple of weeks ago, and you know, just the way in which it was phrased was a bit differently, right? So it starts with apheresis. I think Kate touched on that. Where apheresis is available, is it close enough to a North Dakota physician to be able to do this? To be determined. I think even on the back end, it's even cold chain storage. You know, the cell therapy and CGMP centers have to act as a cell pharmacy. Even in some of the biggest centers, the pharmacy does not have that access. So I think looking at that point is quite important, you know, even in these major centers, and how we spread out from there. So I visited Hershey Medical Center quite recently as well. They're offering CAR T. And I like to look at this as it's not the fact that it's only 2 hours away, it's that it's getting it into a different population and a different connection to the community. a lot of patients I've spoken with recently never want to drive into Philadelphia or New York. That alone, never mind while facing a dire cancer diagnosis, is a lot bigger deal than one might think. So I think it's a start is getting it out of the major centers and into the slightly outside of there in the rural areas. But those areas have to have just those core capabilities, never mind the treatment pre and post after. So I think there's a lot of challenges and the solutions are starting to happen, but how do we, reach a larger network around the whole country and globally is to be figured out.
Does anybody have any comments they'd like to add to that there?
Yeah, George, that is a great overview. I mean, it's a huge disparity that you can only get cell therapy at a major institution, right? And a lot of people don't live near one. With our hospital, we have a network throughout New England and several community hospitals, and the similar sentiments of patients. They don't like driving to Boston. They want to be treated Maine, New Hampshire, wherever they are. And so we can get referrals there, but that's not the luxury everybody has, and it still doesn't touch most of the country. And it's another thing to remember, it's very hard to get up and running to do a CAR T program. It takes a huge investment in money. You're talking about $1 million for cost to do a CAR T. And until you do those first several patients and build up a service, all the nursing that's needed, the processing lab staff, regulatory staff, it's very difficult to do. So a lot of these hospitals that are starting up need a lot of support. And so we're really trying to think of ways, how can we get to these patients? Because patients are often don't know about the best treatments, right? They don't always aren't savvy. And so they'll rely on their physician to recommend the possibility of a CAR T, and then that whole option of how far away is the academic center, how would they pay for the travel, how will they stay locally for the required time frame. So that's very hard. So I think patient education is one aspect that's helpful too. So they don't just rely on their community doctor to have to refer them. So I applaud the efforts George and others are doing to that end.
Just to follow on to that, because we've referenced what possible solutions or the fact that possible solutions are in the works, but what might productive progress look like in disrupting this current model for clinical delivery of cell and gene therapies, and what's needed, or what's the call to action here to improve access from a location point of view?
Georgia. Oh, go ahead, George.
Sure. Yeah, I think Dr. Brannigan actually pointed to something extremely relevant and something that we often see. We think where every new industry is so unique, or every new modality is. But I think one thing to point to is where Dr. Brannigan was going, is we look at the comprehensive cancer center treatment model in the past and how we've spread out through connections into the community. I think if you use that as a model for delivery of cell therapy, there is precedent for it, while definitely being a more complicated supply chain with more, let's say, payer items to figure out along the way. I think that could be a start, is looking at that as in retrospect and trying to model some of that penetration throughout other areas.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that too. I think that something we're trying to do with CGT Global and sort of our healthcare arm within the company is to think about how we can partner and kind of bolt on to healthcare as a potentially, solution provider, or as an overflow partner, right? So for the institutions that have been doing this, that are already sort of hitting max capacity, where could we take over, for example, like nights and weekends doing apheresis in-house, or can patients travel to our locations to be apheresed and get them outside the hospital setting in that capacity, if they're healthy enough to move and be able to do that. I also think through just partnered services and staffing and availability, that seems to come up as a major topic in most institutions right now, is the gaps and availability. I mean, Sarah kind of touched on it, like we have a slot that's available at this time, and that's the option that's available. If we can broaden that and be a good partner to healthcare in a way that opens up those options, right, where they have a secondary schedule of a partner that they can use in this way, that's our hope, and sort of helping to take some of that bandwidth and pressure off the institutions, especially those that are already doing quite a bit in this space.
Excellent, thank you. And you've touched on availability there, so I'd like to move on to that as the next agendaed item. But if we turn now to focus purely on patient availability, what are the current limitations surrounding availability for these therapies for patients, or what would you say are the top challenges in this space when we consider availability? I don't know if Andrew, if you wanted to pick this one up.
Sure, this is really the crux of our discussion here, all the factors that affect access, and there really are so many. So we touched on several of these already, but if you think about a patient's journey to how they get to a CAR T, the timing has to be right with the disease is in the right progression where they're eligible for a therapy. There has to be a spot. And then just kind of stopping there about having a spot at a center, even a center that's well equipped and does lots of CAR T therapies. There's lots of limitations. So there's often set number of spots that can be done every month from the manufacturer. So that's part of this idea of a spot. And then you have to have space to collect a patient. So to do apheresis, as Kate touched on, where CGT is able to partner and help offload that particular bottleneck. Then you have to have space to admit the patient to administer the therapy. So some of these therapies are moving to the outpatient setting, which will help that. But as of now, most centers are administering all these therapies on an inpatient basis. And there's really a shortage of beds in most of the country. I know at our hospital, we're usually in a critical bed shortage and don't have any open beds at any given time. Then you have to have the staff that know how to prepare, process the product, deal with the regulatory issues. And that's actually some of the toughest. And that's one of the biggest bottlenecks. I think Sarah mentioned that the other day, that's our biggest bottleneck is having trained staff, because this is such a popular field. A lot of staff at academic centers will leave because they get so busy and overworked and move to the pharmaceutical industry because those expertise and skills are in so high demand. And so we have a shortage there as well. So that's just touching on some of the bottlenecks in a hospital. But then, the sad thing is, again, these spots are going primarily to patients who have access to the major academic centers. And so you're missing these patients who don't live nearby and certain other patient populations as well. So I can stop it there and see if anyone wants to jump in on any of those topics.
Yeah, I'd like to think of it with three main bottlenecks, right? In the R&D side, we can create more targeted therapies. In the manufacturing side, we can streamline and scale and open up more slots. And Dr. Brannigan talked to the healthcare delivery aspect, but I think that they're not mutually exclusive. If we can, on the R&D side, develop more targeted, less toxic CAR T treatments that require less intensive care, that can actually free up some of the bottleneck on the healthcare side. So it has to be any and all avenues pushing constantly and interacting and collaborating more and understanding each side. I think a lot can go towards understanding the product itself, the manufacturing, and then how that relates to the delivery of healthcare. And, a question we have at the foundation is, to what level should the patient be educated on these technologies? If there's a CRISPR-derived CAR T versus a lentiviral CAR T, does the patient need to know that? And the answer is every patient is different, and every patient wants to know at a varying level. And in a place like CAR T therapy alone that's innovating so quickly, it makes it very hard to educate patients on that end. So we're just focusing on clearing those three main bottlenecks while trying to keep patients getting as many treatments as possible.
I think that's actually addressed my follow-up question there about looking at what potential solutions might disrupt that status quo. So thank you for that one, George. We are going to move on to a kind of final future-looking element of this discussion, because I do want to leave plenty of time for the Q&A. So I'll just pause to remind everybody that we will be taking questions from the audience, so please do submit them. So finally, if we look to close the discussion with a look towards the future, as I referenced, in this context, and with what's going on with the space and everything we've covered today, what might the patient experience look like, or what do we hope it's going to look like in 5 to 10 years' time if the industry continues to grow at the rate it is, and if we can implement some of the solutions that we've discussed? Kate, should we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say is, Dr. Brannigan knows well Dr. Graves, who's also one of our medical directors, and he's very focused on tumor care coming down in this space. And I think that is a ultimate game changer when we think about what could happen as therapies get approved for tumor-related treatments. And I think that, my hope as we look out from this is, we rely less on the healthcare institution to build it organically from scratch at every location globally, because I think that is a very scalable issue, that if we're going to keep relying on these healthcare facilities in that way, and we start to think more broadly through partnerships and connections to different groups, so that we can scale faster as a team versus relying so heavily on these groups that, like Sarah and Dr. Brannigan know firsthand as being on the front, call them, they're the front line to what's happening here, and they're juggling so much. And so as we think about more and more therapies, as we think about even a third of that slide that I showed on the screen coming forward, my hope is that we look out 5 years and we have these, great partnerships on a global way to relieve some of that pressure on the healthcare system and to elevate access and scalability across the systems by doing so.
Excellent. Thank you. George, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's great points, Kate. And I think beyond that, as we think about it from the patient point of view, much to my last comment, parents and patients and caregivers don't really care what modality is curing people, despite a lifetime of CAR T and cell therapy. For me, as we speak with more and more patients and more advocacy groups, it's really a rare disease question, and they're exploring any and all avenues. And it's given a lot of hope, the cell and gene therapy space, to these patients. But I think continuing to push on the innovation side, whether it's an in vivo CAR T or a gene therapy or other, so many times I see on panels and questions, autologous versus allogeneic, or this versus that. The answer is all of them. And I think you need to push on the innovation side, and cell therapy and gene therapy has opened up avenues for treatment that weren't there before. And we're also seeing that reignite innovation in small molecule and others, with antibody drug conjugates and others. So I think 5 years ago, in my head, it was CAR Ts are going to cure everything. But as you dig in with patients and you see dormant modalities and ideas popping up, that's what gives hope. And I think that's where it'll push us all to do more on all sides. And focusing on this very difficult cell and gene space is one way, but there's many others.
Sarah, do you have anything you'd like to add to that question?
Sure. I grew up on a dairy farm in Vermont, so I understand these patients that are reluctant to come to the city because it's a very overwhelming process for them, and financially difficult. We rely on the manufacturers' programs a lot of times to help with travel and lodging, but I'll tell all of my patients, like, we're doing this is a substantial short-term investment in hopefully long-term gains. It would be great to have them closer to home, but along with improving access, we also have to think about the education for the staff and the caregivers, because these are very complex treatments, and it's not like giving chemo or a pill, so the providers and the staff surrounding the patients also have to learn exquisite care of these cell therapies because they are a little different.
Excellent. And Andrew?
Sure, these are all such great points and something not everyone thinks about it. The aftercare and survivorship after CAR T can be quite challenging. Sarah just made me think of that. But thinking ahead of about 5 years, couple things. One, I agree with George. I think we always need new innovation, and there's all kinds of different therapies coming. It's a bit of a double-edged sword because I do think we will be flooded with some of those studies that Kate alluded to in her slide. And not everyone is as forward-thinking as Kate. And I really appreciate that she's trying to think ahead because we really should be more proactive and not reactive. What I think will happen is we will get a solid tumor CAR T approval soon. We have some very promising findings in early studies. And I think there'll be some chaos when that happens, much to the early approval of some of the blood cancer CAR Ts, where everybody's trying to get a spot. And the other a big breakthrough that I think will come very soon is to use a CAR T for autoimmune diseases. And similarly, there'll be, the field will be overwhelmed with the desire to get patients on those therapies. So that's a bit of the double-edged sword that I fear.
Excellent, thank you. I suppose actually one final question from myself is more to our panel. If anybody wants to speak to or knows of any projects, initiatives, or ideas really that are going on in this space that will ultimately impact and improve patient access to cell and gene therapies. I'll hand that back to the panel to see if anybody has anything they'd like to speak to that.
I think one thing that Dr. Brannigan brings up is an important part of the Emily Whitehead Foundation is that aftercare, and often not thought about is what happens when you're cured, right? Emily is at 11 years now, and we think about what it's like to be a teenager during COVID, and then, a famous patient teenager during COVID, and the sheer need for mental health support and other activities along the way with facing this through an early childhood and living through it, along with the metabolic issues we see through cancer survivors. So I think there's a lot of aftercare, even beyond cured and even beyond that. And I think the best part of it is we're going to see more of that, but we have to focus on building programs for these unique situations that patients never lived through before. So it's another forward-looking piece that the Emily Whitehead Foundation is looking forward to. What programs need to be built in this unique space where people were never cured from these stage 4 dire consequences? And that's something we're working on for the future of the foundation here.
Yeah, and I'll just add into that too, Georgie, your question is great. And what George said here, I think, for us, as busy as we all are, I think it's so important to remember bringing people outside of our world into our world to get them exposure. Something we do here is we do high school internships through college and, PhD programs and such as well. But I'm always amazed when I see like our high school students come in the summer and just light up with realizing what we're all doing and working on. I think it's incredibly exciting, and to a lot of folks in the general community, they're not aware of what's coming down the pipeline, right? I'm always amazed when I sort of see the lights come on for people in this space. And I think we need to continue to, as much as possible, expose people, to encourage them to move into these fields, to get further education and join us in this journey.
Excellent, thank you. We'll now move into the Q&A because we do have a few questions already, but we do have time for more, so please do submit your questions if you'd like them addressed online, and if we don't get to them, we will come back to them offline for you. So our first question that's come through is that studies show that minority participation in clinical trials is disproportionate to representation in the population, partially due to being less likely to be offered trial information. How can we increase awareness of clinical trial opportunities among underrepresented groups? George, I don't know if you want to get us started with this question.
Yeah, I think that's something that's been a core tenet of the Emily Whitehead Foundation, right down to Carrie creating a clinical trial finder on the Emily Whitehead Foundation website specific for pediatric treatments. But I think given the unique nature of cell therapy, regenerative medicine, and others, there's other tools that are needed to further educate in the more innovative space. I've spent a lot of time in my life on clinicaltrials.gov. There are a lot of trials listed and not very easy to navigate. And what I've come to learn over the last couple of years is that they're actually not all validated by the FDA. So being in the cell collection and CGMP cell space prior to the patient side of my career, that was always a concern, is validating these trials specifically in some of the stem cell based trials for arthritis and others. So one way that we've been growing at the Emily Whitehead Foundation and thinking beyond that, started collaborating and with the team at True Trials. So it's a navigatable website that features all cell, gene, and regenerative medicine trials. And I think getting it in a more accessible way, in a viewable format, and coupling that with the right advocacy and knowledge of cell, gene, and other therapies is a great start. Lots of institutions are going this route, but I see some of it being a bit cumbersome, and having a map that's able to click through and connect, that's supported by the FDA, is something we're really passionate about to help get rid of that disparity between groups. But I think there's lots of other ways and even more we can do beyond the creation of that tool to help out.
Yeah, and I'll just add into that question too, Georgie, is that, one thing that stands out to me is, when Joe Biden was vice president and Beau Biden was very ill, and ultimately passed away, he ended up talking very publicly and about the access to clinical trials and just his own frustration when he was sitting as the vice president in trying to know where to go and what to access. And, what was so just, kind of took the air out of my lungs when that happened was that if someone in that position struggles so desperately to try to understand and access clinical trials, what does the rest of the world do who doesn't have the power at their fingertips to have that kind of access and people surrounding them that has that power, and that's always what plagues me, right? Is I want just the average person to be able to access these things like anyone else that is has wealth or other access to them. And I think that like George mentioned, a lot of these groups that are now starting and leaning into or trying to answer those questions and create more versatile access. And I think that's very crucially important in our space.
Great. And I love the question. I think equity is so important, and it's a big focus that many of us have. And it's not just cell therapy, it's true in general. For most treatments and cancer therapies and cancer trials, they're mostly white, and minorities are not adequately represented. I focus on a disease, multiple myeloma, and it's more common in Black people. Yet we have our trials are mostly white people. And so we're always trying to think of ways to overcome this. Our hospital is a general hospital, so we actually serve everybody. We don't turn anyone away. So our numbers are a little better than a lot of the other major institutions, which tend to be even more white. So we're trying to do things like engage with the community. We do fairs and outreach education events. And we've also partnered with the major hospital that provides free care in Boston. And we've opened up a pathway so that patients can do trials, because a lot of patients who get free care end up at one certain hospital, at least in Boston, is kind of how that works. So we're always trying that. We're making small strides. But I think what's needed is we really need better partnerships with other community hospitals, between academic hospitals, community hospitals, and more education. There's a lot of distrust, especially if you think of the Black population with the Tuskegee trials, the awful history, and people remember that, and they don't trust trials. They don't want to be a guinea pig, and so I think we need ways. I think George is doing tremendous efforts, but other ways to really educate patients on the importance of trials, how that's really how you get access to the best cutting edge care.
Excellent, thank you. We do have a couple of minutes to go. I think that would have been a beautiful point to end on, but just I'm going to slip in one quick question before we go. What are the challenges involved with the transport of these cells? Is it time sensitive?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Georgie, since, we transport cells globally all over the world every day. And, Sarah and I even touched on this yesterday in a conversation we had together. This is not a normal practice of healthcare either, right? Is how you move and deal with the logistics of, rate controlled, temp tracked units, GPS monitored tracking of these sort of units so that you can show an audit trail and everything else that is necessary to meet FDA standards and guidelines for these therapies. And so it's a huge logistics hell, quite frankly, for a lot of healthcare institutions. On a recent call we were just on with a healthcare partner, they were immediately asking us to take over managing some logistics on some patient cell transports. And it was no surprise to me that that was a huge struggle for them, because it's just not how they're built to handle that, right? You think about, and just to answer this question more broadly, but for those who might not understand this visually, when you're freezing down cells in cryo tanks and then you need cryo shippers that track temperature and have liquid nitrogen in them, you can't just hand these to like any general carrier. And then the secondary part is, does that carrier even know how to handle to transit that? We've had issues where, we've had products shipping globally and, the unit tips over in transit and has liquid nitrogen in it. And so we can start to see the temperature rising on the unit, have to get a hold of the transit provider and say, hey, something's going on with the unit. You need to send someone to go check on this and deal with it. And so that kind of logistics, that air traffic controller kind of ability is something that we have at CGT, but it's something that's not typical, again, in a healthcare environment. So that logistics is very, very crucial to making sure that, if a patient had one shot at having their cells collected, we cannot have that fail in transit, right? And that's a really crucial part of the equation that people, I think, sometimes overlook in the logistics.
Excellent, thank you. We are coming up to the end of time, so I'm going to just wrap that up there. I apologise if we did not get a chance to address your questions today. We will be sure to send these questions all to CGT Global to address offline. Now I'm just going to bring up a slide briefly with some more information for you. I'm not sure how well you can see that, unfortunately. My view's completely gone, but I'm hoping that you can see a contact us QR code there from the CGT Global team. If you do want to find out more, please do make sure you get in touch. That's all from us today. So I'd like to just thank our panelists for joining us and for answering all of our questions, and also to remind our audience that you can access this session offline, on demand, through the network or via the Facilitate website. Again, that's all from us today. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one.